Hello and welcome to Merthyr's Hidden Past, a weekly podcast brought to you by Cyfarthfa Castle Museum and Art Gallery in Merthyr Tydfil. My name is Christopher Parry and I work at Cyfarthfa Castle Museum. And every week for the last, I think we're in our fourth week now, episode 4. Every week I've been bringing you different stories from Merthyr Tydfil's past. Now, as I say at the start of most episodes, this podcast is not dedicated to the well-known parts of Merthyr's history. Its industrial supremacy, the coal history, the crotchets, the other ironmasters. Instead, it's dedicated to the lesser-known stories that were happening on the peripherals of all that. And so, this week is no exception. Even though probably or possibly this week's story may well be more known to some of you than the previous weeks. Possibly. We'll see. Let me know. Comment on SoundCloud or on the Facebook page or anywhere you can really to let me know if you knew about this already and if you got any extra information. Last week's episode was all about John Denethorne and the Dowless education settlements, and it was lovely to hear some comments and to read some comments on Facebook and other places about people's memories of John Denethorne and other things like that, because it's things like that that really help us in the museum to interpret stories and histories like this, because a lot of these hidden stories are hidden because people don't see the strength or the power in them, or they've forgotten them, and so the only way they get to exist and be reborn in this format or in museum interpretation or anything like that is by talking about them. And I can't do all the talking as much as sometimes I seem to, but if you can still continue your amazing support with this podcast, it would be fantastic. Over the 3 episodes, we've had over 400 people listen to all of the episodes combined, which is phenomenal and really genuinely appreciated in every way, shape and form. So continue to listen, share, tell friends about it, because again, while we are closed at Cyfarthfa Castle, this is a really important way to engage with our public, our users, and to keep local history ticking over. And so I hope you enjoy this week's episode. It's all about a gentleman called Dick Tamar, and he quite possibly is Merthyr's only serial killer. On April 23rd, 1842, a body was discovered in a small house just off Plymouth Street in Merthyr Tydfil. Now when I say a small house, it was pretty much a one-room house. Kitchen, bedroom, everything, just in the one room. And this body was discovered stuffed under a bed. Now, before we get into that, the house belonged to a lady named Tamar Edwards. She had a son in 1813 and named him Richard. Richard grew up to become an iron miner. Now, Richard first started appearing in local newspapers and gaining some reputation around 1839. In that year, a London newspaper called the Morning Chronicle ran an article with the headline, "A Barbarous Murder at Merthyr." Many local newspapers and local news outlets ran the same headline. It was all to do with a lady named Ellen Murphy. In December of 1839 she was murdered. Newspapers also mentioned that Ellen was an unfortunate, and that's a very 19th century term for a prostitute. Some 19th century newspapers would call them nymphs of the pave. One very dramatic Merthyr Telegraph writer would call them angels with clipped wings. She was found in the parish pound with her clothes ripped, beaten violently and strangled to death. There was one suspect in the murders, and that was Richard Edwards, who was known locally as Dick Tamar. Now Dick denied any wrongdoing in this crime, and in fact when police visited his house just off Plymouth Street where he was living with his mother Tamar, she backed his story up and said that he was home by 11 o'clock on the night of the murder and couldn't have committed the murder against Ellen, which they had established apparently happened slightly later. They asked Tamar for Dick's clothes, and on examination of the clothes they found they were covered in a lot of mud and other things, and so they suspected him enough. And given the fact that he was in fact the last person to be seen with Ellen, they arrested him. And a jury was formed, and a trial to try and establish guilt was arranged and took place in the Angel Hotel, or Angel Inn rather, at the bottom end of Merthyr town. Now, as I said, Dick denied the charges, and he denied anything being out of the ordinary with his clothes or anything like that, even though the police investigating discovered that the mud on his clothes, which is for 1842, I think this is for 1839 rather, this is an amazing thing, that the police were comparing the mud on his clothes with the mud on the clothes of the victim and trying to see similarities without scientific analysis. I'm guessing a lot of mud in Victorian Merthyr looked kind of similar. But they did mention there was manure on his clothing, which was significant because they were storing manure in the parish pound where the body was found, and the body had manure and that smell of manure on it as well. Not only that, Dick's clothes, the knees of his trousers and the coat and everything had mud, and when questioned he said that, "I think I fell over." But there was also blood stains found on his clothes as well, and when questioned about them he said, "I think I might have had a nosebleed on Monday." All quite flimsy excuses really in the face of what he was being accused of. His saviour though was Tamar, his mother. Her eyewitness account kept him out of the time frame. She stated that he was home with her by 11. Even though there was another witness, a Matthew Williams, who was drinking in the Swan Inn with Richard that night. He said that he was walking home, he left the pub, Richard still being there, he left the pub and headed down to his house in Pentrabach. Now he knew Tamar Edwards, so he said he stopped at her house, and shortly after 12 p.m. Dick got home. Now the judge was instantly quite miffed obviously by the contradiction, and he didn't know which one was purging the evidence, and in his own words, which person was throwing a cloak over the evidence. He also said, but because both of these witnesses were quite old, Tamar being in her 60s by this point, and the witness Matthew being in his 80s, he said they should even be more ashamed, because they should know better than to try and protect someone of this age in life and lie. They couldn't identify that exact time frame, and they couldn't identify which person was lying. But a jury still found Richard guilty of that crime, still found him guilty of murdering Ellen Murphy, strangling her to death and leaving the body discarded in the parish pound in 1839. So Dick was sent down to Cardiff to have a full trial, a sentencing and everything else. So he was kept in Cardiff jail until February of 1840. But then when the full criminal case was brought against Dick, he was found not guilty. The evidence was insufficient to convict apparently. So Dick returned back to Merthyr, and a few months later, on July 13th, 1840, he married Margaret Morgan, or Peggy as he would call her. Now Margaret Morgan was the daughter of William Morgan, who was a miner who lived at the Redecar cottages. Later that very same year, Dick would appear straight away in the press and in the criminal records again for a similar crime once more. He had committed an unprovoked and violent attack on a woman along the tram road in Merthyr. He was arrested for this crime and proved guilty. He was sentenced to pay 40 shillings for his crime, but he couldn't pay that, so he did serve some jail time in lieu of payment. In the same time frame, his name was also linked to several other crimes. So that first crime, murdering Ellen in a pound, everyone in the town was convinced that he had been the murderer, without a shadow of a doubt. And they were shocked that he got off on it because of the amount of eyewitness statements linking Dick to her at the last moment she was seen, and the state of his clothing and the blood being on it. They were also amazed that he didn't get a sterner sentence for beating a woman nearly to death on the tram road. But then another body was found. A body was found on the Pendarren cinder tips. This body was half burned, but even though it was burnt, you could still see and identify that it had been beaten violently and was left discarded on the cinder tips of Pendarren. There was only one suspect and one person's name put forward for that crime, and again it was Dick Tamar's name that appeared. A woman was robbed on the Aberdeen mountainside and beaten. Dick's name came up again. Lack of any evidence, same as the other crimes, to convict. The next crime that he would be convicted for would leave him nowhere to hide. There would be an abundance of evidence to tie him to it. And that brings us to where we started. April 23rd, 1842. 178 years ago, the day this podcast goes out, which is not planned. A body was discovered stuffed under the bed in Tamar Edwards' house. The body was Tamar Edwards herself. Living in this house at this time was Dick, his wife Peggy, and Tamar. Now Tamar, even though the press accounts put her to being 70 to 75, she was pretty much 60 to 65. So I think the hard Merthyr world, hard industrial life had put some years on her. But either way, she was found dead under the bed. Now how did she come to be discovered first and foremost? Well, this came from Peggy first. And it's a strange thing. Now keep in mind, through all of this, is that this is a one-room house. There's little to nowhere to hide anything. There's very bare amount of furniture, which is quite common in working industrial houses like this. There wouldn't be much furniture at all apart from tables, beds, and possibly some chairs. And so there's very few places to hide. Peggy was round at a friend's house. And she mentioned to this friend, who's named Martha, that Dick got a bit angry with her when she was cleaning the house and he wouldn't let her clean under the bed. And she said she thought he was hiding something. And so Martha said, oh, well, why don't you look? And she said, no, I'm too afraid to look. And so she said, if you would come with me, you could have a look. I'm too scared of what Dick would do to me if I would have a look. So Martha and Peggy went down. And Martha then saw the body of Tamar Edwards, this 60-odd-year-old woman lying dead under the bed. She was cold to the touch and she was even starting to smell with the decomposition. Martha was instantly angry and shouted at Peggy as well, because Peggy was as bad as Dick in her eyes, because she had been sleeping there with the body under there. And by that statement, I kind of understand that Martha found it hard to believe that Peggy wasn't aware that this body was under the bed she was sleeping. The police were called, they examined the body, and the cause of death was strangulation. Merthyr newspaper said most of the townspeople in Merthyr became temporary constables, and everyone went out in search of Dick Tamar to try and arrest him and bring him in. On April the 27th, he was found, and he was found by the father-in-law, William Morgan, Peggy's father. He had been told by certain people that Dick Tamar was just sitting in a field, and so he went to this field, and the information was correct. There, sitting in the field, whittling a piece of wood with a knife, was Dick Tamar. First he asked him to put the knife down, and Dick Tamar said, why? And he said, because a knife doesn't suit you. And he said, if you don't put it down, I'll take it from you. And Dick didn't put it down. He was not on his own. He was with his son, and he was with many other workmen who had all followed William and his sons when they had heard he was going to apprehend Dick Tamar. And so he asked his son to give him his mandrill, a pick. Most of you might know this miner's tool as. But as soon as William had the mandrill, he started approaching Dick Tamar and asked him to put the knife down. And lo and behold, he did, and he came with him. On the way, Dick was saying, well, why are you taking me? He said, well, you've murdered your mother. And he was denying it all the way. As the crowd passed through the town on the way to the police station, the crowd grew and grew and grew. And there was hundreds, if not 1,000 or so people with this crowd by the time they got to the police station. A lot of the crowd wanted to lynch him straight away. And a lot of the people of the town thought that was okay. Some of them even thought that it would be the best idea to take him to the parish pound where he had killed Ellen in previous years. and hang him there. That was how convinced people of the town were of his committal of that crime. But either way, they didn't kill him on that day. A jury was again assembled at the Angel Inn in Merthyr, and they found him guilty quite early on, because the amount of witness testimonial left him nowhere to hide, really, because everyone was asking where she was. And when Dick answered that, he didn't say, "Oh, she's under my bed." He just said, "Oh, she's off to another parish collecting some money and collecting some money from another parish." And so he was making excuses about where she was. And so that was suspicious. The fact that she was strangled, which has been a previous kind of thing in Richard's crimes, even though he wasn't convicted for those crimes. And all the evidence just slowly stacked against him. And he went to Cardiff to be sentenced. The death sentence was issued to him, and it would be carried out in July 1842. Now, to return back to Peggy, his wife, Peggy was accused by Dick of having more to do with the crime while he was imprisoned. And you can kind of understand why this accusation would come when you think to yourself, well, there was 3 people living in a one-room house, and suddenly one of them is dead and murdered and shoved under a bed, and only one of those people present know that the body's there. Witnesses a few days before, a witness came forward in the trial saying that he popped along to the house to see where Tamar Edwards was, and when he got there, Dick told him, "Oh, she is off to another parish at the moment." And when he got there, he saw Peggy was cleaning vigorously around the bed, in his testimony. And in the days even previous to that, William Morgan was housing his daughter Peggy at this point, because Peggy was afraid to go back to live with Dick. Now, when Dick came to William's house to ask for Peggy to come back to live with him, William raised in front of him that Peggy was afraid of him and of him being violent and him threatening to kill her and all this type of stuff. But then when William raised that in Peggy's presence in front of Dick, she got a bit apologetic and she tried to make excuses and take back what she had said. So later on that day, the father went into a rage, ranted at his daughter and kicked her out and didn't want anything more to do with her. It was at the end of his tether, apparently, with her. And so she went to stay with her auntie. And on April the 18th, Dick came again and asked her to live with him. She asked where they were going to live, and he said in his mother's house. And she said, "Oh, she's just going to chuck me out like she has done before," implying that this has happened a few times. Dick said, "Oh, just leave my mother to me." And so the pair went to live in Tamar Edwards' house on April the 18th. Whether or not the marriage and Peggy and Dick living in Tamar's house had something to do with her death, and whether she didn't want it and she was kicking up a fuss, I have no idea. There's loads of unknowns in this, but the one thing that is known is that Dick was put to death for this crime in July 1842. In the days before his execution, Dick actually made a confession which changed a lot of the narrative and a lot of the things that we understood the story to be. First and foremost, his signed confession changed the time scale of the murder. In Dick's report, she actually was murdered on April 14th. And then she was discovered on April 23rd, which we know from the police on the Saturday, the April 23rd, 1842. Dick's story was as follows. But there was also a key extra person involved in this story that hadn't been mentioned at all apart from this confession, and that was Dick's son. Dick and Peggy actually had a 10-month-old son that was in the house with them. So in the house on that April 14th night was Peggy, Margaret, his wife, Dick, the 10-month-old son, Tamar, the mother, but then 2 other people as well, according to Dick. The brother of Peggy and Peggy's mother. Now, Dick says, outright unflinchingly, that he punched his mother clean in the jaw and knocked her down to the ground. Why he did this, according to him, is Peggy was screaming out that his mother was attacking her. And then, according to Dick, he did not kill her with that blow because she was groaning on the floor. Now, while on the floor, the brother and the mother and Peggy all got on top of her, apparently, and were scuffling with her, and then they held her down and choked the life out of her. Now, Dick didn't say one specific person choked her and put their hands around her neck. He actually said all three choked the life out of her. Then, what happened is Dick realised that his mother was dead. He was obviously upset in his confession. His wife, Peggy, begged him not to tell anyone. He agreed, and they all stayed there until dawn trying to figure out what was going on. They picked the mother up and put her on the bed next to the 10-month-old boy, believe it or not. In the following day, Peggy was asking Dick to go and bury his mother. He refused because he was afraid of getting caught by taking the body out of the house, he said. So the body remained there. Dick left the house and Peggy left the house also. Peggy went to her father's briefly, and then, as we know in the time scale outlined in the trial, went to her auntie's in Cadraw. In Cadraw, Dick goes back to the house and tries to get Peggy and the boy now, the 10-month-old son, back to the house, which, as we know from the other reports, happened. They went back to the house, but according to Dick, they went back on Monday the 18th of April, which is the same day that Peggy's auntie did say that they left to go back to this Plymouth Street house. And there, they slept for 5 days before the body was discovered on the Saturday. Dick swears blind and swears on his dying confession, essentially, that he didn't kill her because she was still groaning when she was alive, that he is guilty of many, many crimes, but he's not guilty of theft or murder, apparently. That's what he said. But it gives the whole murder and the whole narrative a totally different turn and twist. And it adds doubt into Peggy's involvement and things like that. But it's up to you which side of this you kind of believe, because there's so much non-known and there's so much evidence that needed to be gathered. It can be interpreted in multiple ways. Some 11,000 people turned up to watch him be hung. 11,000, most of them Merthyr inhabitants that have been outraged by this crime. However you look at it, there's a lot of unknowns about Dick Tamar's criminal career. Some say that just being guilty of killing your mother is enough. When you look at the evidence and look at the testimony given by witnesses, you can see quite easily that the crimes he committed were far larger in scale than his criminal record would show, really. There is every possibility that he murdered at least 3 people. Ellen Murphy, the as yet unknown lady who was discovered on Pendarren Cinder Tip. Unknown because I haven't discovered her name yet, unfortunately. And his mother, Tamar Edwards. That brings us to the end of this week's podcast and this week's story. And hopefully, I'm planning next week to have a much more joyful story than a murder. Because I thought nice balance, and you know, we'll do a story about a medium, then we'll do a story about philanthropy, and then we'll do a story about a murder. It's creating a balance in the podcast world, hopefully. But yeah, next week we will come back on Thursday next week with another hidden story from Merthyr's past, and hopefully you've enjoyed. And again, share, comment, let us know what you think. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. Take care.